Recently in Australia, there's been talk about introducing EVs or electrical vehicles to replace petrol cars in this sort of mad panic rush in Australia about saving the planet or saving the climate or reducing emissions. The anomaly in this is a strange fact is right from the very beginning, for 20 years now, Australia's been on this path to sort of reduce emissions. By the same token, it's making sure it cannot reduce them by the actions it's taken. Because by introducing the wind and solar as a replacement for baseload energy, it's making sure for certainty it can no longer charge EVs. Say it replaced fuel cars with EVs, it cannot replace them because it simply doesn't have the amperage going through the system to charge whole heap of cars. And certainly households simply with solar and relying on wind cannot rely on the fact that you're able to charge your car up, especially in the evenings when everyone's come home from work and want to recharge the car at the same time they're using all the appliances in the house, including electric cookers. Now, it's a good idea to take an example and examine what China's doing, because what they have in China is a more free intellectual speech in regards to solving what are pragmatic problems than what Australia has taken in view of climate change or the challenge of climate change. And what the Chinese have done is rationalize this and created a geometric, mathematical perspective, if you like, to then take on to the science of climate change is, in other words, is different to the maths required to solve the problem. Right? The science said the climate's changing, but what is the problem? What is the challenges, and what are the challenges? And how do you solve them? They're almost mathematical. They're a mathematical component. They're not a political one as such, as it's taken Australia as a purely political one in regard to the emissions reductions. And it's actually what it has done and it is doing is defeating its ability to reduce emissions, which is majority of emissions in all countries are motor cars. And in what China has done, because it sees it as an emergency or urgency to reduce the amount of pollutants and particulates, in particular from diesel, that will cause ill health problems because the particles in the air from diesels alone are dangerous, as it's recognized now in Europe. But so they've said, well, we can build clean coal-fired power stations, which are HELA power stations are pretty reasonably clean. It only emits CO2, which is not a pollutant as such, and it doesn't emit any particles because it's because of the actually engineering involved in that system. But what it is doing by doing that is creating the baseload component beforehand, so then it can accelerate the introduction of EVs or electrical vehicles and therefore accelerate its reductions of emissions out into the future. Australia is taking exactly the opposite stance, in that it's rushed into renewables and solar panels and individualize them, which makes sense to some people but makes no sense mathematically. And when you're trying to run an economy in the grid, the breaking up of individual solar panels on each house makes no sense at all. It sounds like an attractive thing to do, but it's a very, very poor economics and just creates debts into individual households without actually solving any of the problems required in view of the challenges involved in reducing emissions, which is then to reduce the amount of fossil fuels, especially diesel, into the system, and reducing them out of the system, and therefore, because they're getting rid of baseload, and the Labour Party and the Liberals, and they're all in it together, are introducing, trying to destroy the baseload power stations, destroy the means of recharging thousands and millions and millions of vehicles, big heavy vehicles, have to be recharged every day at a constant rate. But they cannot do that because they're destroying the very means of being able to recharge the vehicles. They're all against coal-fired power stations. They're all against it at the same time. So therefore, they're actually against being able to reduce emissions. The people who are against coal-fired power stations are against being able to reduce the emissions, which are the majority of them are on the road in fossil fuel cars. Now, this is something that, because they've rushed in to this, and they've got into massive amount of debt to subsidise a wind and solar energy systems, when they should have been looking at, first of all, having a planning strategy what actually made sense mathematically, regardless of the science of climate change. The two things are separate. Science of climate change is a totally separate matter to the challenges that are involved in it, in a reality sense, in a realistic sense, because you have to run an economy. You have to be able to efficiently run an economy far into the future and plan that. That is a far more important factor in itself, because if you destroy your own economy, and your economic means to overcome these challenges, and destroy the economic means and the actual practical means of implementing the actual means to reduce emissions, then obviously there's something a greater deal missing in the forward planning over the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, within the Australian political system, because it seems to be missing some ability into a creatively, intelligently philosophize on ways to deal with what are practical and pragmatic problems in a positive way for the benefit of society. It seems to me that the only thing people that are benefiting from the challenge of climate change in Australia are a sort of a socialist elite, and all those people within who benefit by the subsidy of renewable energy. But what they're doing is putting a massive drag, economic drag and financial drag upon the system, and at the same time retarding any ability to introduce EVs. And introducing EVs itself, I've done an awful lot of work in this, sat down and looked at the logistics of this. And it's very, very difficult in Australia, because if you live remotely, you might have long distances to go to visit your relatives or wherever, and to putting where do you start with your infrastructure what recharges your cars? Where do you start with that, and what's the fair thing to do in that? And therefore you have to ask yourself, should Australia not look at a totally different system, indigenous to itself, to sort of change its the new generation of vehicles maybe has to be developed within this country as separate to any other, so it doesn't have to import vehicles, it builds them here. And there are ways of doing that. There are ways of creating vehicles that will charge themselves. They're not on the market just yet, because the reason they're not on the market, and it's called permanent magnetic motors, will allow vehicles and households to run differently and separately, and reduce the cost of living and everything. But the problem is the government does not know how to go about getting itself involved into what is real next generation of motor vehicles, which will be self-driven and also possibly rechargeable to a great extent, because they'll be sort of hybrids, or because of the sort of motors they have, or they'll be hydrogen. And it means that Australia intends to import vehicles from China or Japan or Korea that really have such a limited use. You can't charge them at home because you haven't got the amps at home, because you haven't, and if the wind isn't blowing that day, you can't drive your car. You could drive somewhere in your car, and you could be getting on your journey and you're pulling somewhere. Sorry, we've got no power because the wind hasn't been blowing, or it's been dull days for a few days, the sun hasn't been shining, wind hasn't been blowing, and so there's 1,000 cars stuck up between Brisbane and wherever it is, the Sunshine Coast, is 25,000 cars stuck up in Brisbane and Sunshine Coast, unable to be recharged, full of screaming kids and people sweating to death over the Christmas holidays, because when you drive an EV, and I've had an EV for a long time, I've had electric bikes for many years now, you get familiar with, yes, they've got a maximum distance. I've got an e-bike, and maximum distance is 50 k's, but as soon as you get any hills or headwinds or carry extra loads on it, your potential distance is reduced marginally and very quickly. And this is when they say a car does 500 kilometers on a charge, that is with one person on a flat road driving in a particular way. But when you've got bumper to bumper traffic, air conditioning going, 3 or 4 kids and baggage and everything else going on holidays on a hot day, then you've got a very limited amount of distance you go on your car. And so you can see immediately there are logistical problems of phenomenal proportions to change from petrol to be able to fill up in 2 minutes or 5 minutes at a petrol station. You don't have to fill up, just put $10 wherever you can get to the next place. But when you have an EV, you have to fill it right up to make sure you can get to the next place. And then the logistics are fabulous. The amount of acreage you need on a main route, trunk route, or major route, say, or during a holiday when everyone goes in Australia they habitually and they enjoy the leisure time of using a motor vehicle. You got 20,000 cars leave Brisbane or whatever it is, go up to Hervey Bay and what have you. You have to think, well, how much acreage do you have to supply the amount of linkage points, charging points for the amount of cars you need, and then you have to extrapolate that throughout the country, and then you have to say, will we have enough wind and solar on those particular days to charge that under the present regime of destroying the means to charge them? And the fact that the Labour Party and Greens and others are against having nuclear energy means either these people are not capable of having an intelligent conversation about this, or they're acting on purpose to destroy the actual means of mobility, if you like, in this country, by creating all sorts of political barriers to the solutions required in Australia to solve the problems they say there are. In actual fact, Australia has no problems in dealing with climate other than the variables it has, because it does not affect, Australia cannot affect the global climate because of the tiny percentage of CO2 it emits anyway. Within the natural variables within the planet itself so overwhelms the Australian even a constant CO2 output from Australia that the carry on and fuss in Australia about climate change actually in itself makes no sense either politically or socially or anyway intellectually. It's just something we all engage in now because, well, we've been dragged into and being engaged with it because we've been forced, because the political parties have sort of conspired, if you like, along with major media, to sort of go along with what is patently, mathematically unworkable. Even if they totally believe in what they say, even if they absolutely totally believe it, more than the Muslims believe in God, they believe in this climate change thing. No, there's not the mathematics alone is so appallingly bad. That in itself is an appalling problem that they are creating. And if EVs is one particular example of why they have never considered the logistically, the mathematically, the problem of bringing wind and solar in means you can't charge up a mass amount of cars. And because you simply can't rely on the wind and solar to build a building, to pump in the amount of amperage needed, plus running all your stoves and your lifts and everything else in your town and your electric trains and all that need to a constant supply of energy. And you can't get that with wind and solar. It's impossible. No matter how, if you totally flooded this country with wind and solar, you put it everywhere, and everywhere you saw wind and solar, you still cannot guarantee that you have a supply of electricity on any given day. Because the wind is not reliable. And there's a lot of sun in Australia. And then there's all sorts of logistics problems with distances and losing of power over distance and all that involved with all of that. That never seems to be considered. The thing about EVs, though, I've had one for years. It's called an e-bike. You can buy them now on the net for $1,000 or less, or whatever you want to pay for them, and that solves. Right now, you can get 20,000 people off the road onto an EV just by going to eBay or go down to the shop and buy an electric bike. You can certainly have it in Canberra. There's no excuse. There's no need for this political subsidy of anything that can be bought and driven and ridden on and enjoyed. And all the government's got to do in that respect is look at the electric bike itself as a means of solving some of this transport problem, and maybe developing that idea so that takes in consideration the distances and the weight of the people riding them and stuff like that, and maybe modernising that and making cities so the 30 kilometres an hour speed limits within precincts, and then that allows in the very fast introduction of an EVs that are e-bikes are already all sorts of configurations. So you can get them covered. You can get them all sorts of configurations. So you can introduce e-bikes or electric vehicles right now that can be charged from home from these wind generators. Because they don't use much. They're not using a massive amount of amperage, and you can do that right now. So there's no need for all of the fuss or the promise to do something like 50% of cars by 2030, because that they're destroying the means to actually charge them. By the time the Labour Party, it said they're going to have 50% emissions reduction by 2030, and 50%, it's like a mantra, 50% electric cars by then. It's destroyed the means to charge them. In other words, it really doesn't know what it's talking about, does it? Not having an intelligent conversation between itself.